right, welcome everyone to our next episode of Unique Insights in Bible Prophecy. As always, this is a series wherein we take a question about Bible prophecy, we try to answer that, then we invite you as the listener to leave a grade at the end of the video. And so we'll go over the grading system when we get to the end. However, we do encourage you to pay attention, think of the question yourself, what your answer would be to it, and then look at the evidences that we give throughout the video, which also, again, will be highlighted at the end, and then give your view on it as to whether or not you were convinced or so. All right, so our question today is, what is the differences between the trumpets and the vials? And the reason why we're asking this is because the traditional view, which anybody knows our channel knows we're going to disagree with this some. The traditional view is that the seals are the first 3.5 years, which this is where we're going to disagree, because I'll even show tonight in this lesson the seals can't be the first 3.5 years only. They have to cover into the last 3.5 years of the tribulation as well. However, the traditional teaching that I've always heard taught is that the seals are the first 3.5 years, and then the trumpets and the vials are the last 3.5 years, but there's repetition. And so I agree that the trumpets and the vials repeat over the same time period. However, it is a fair question to ask why, especially if you believe that the seals don't also cover that time period. If you follow our belief wherein you have the telescopic view and you're zooming in, then it's not that unreasonable of a thing. It's not really that much of a question, even, to be honest. But if you're looking at this from the traditional perspective, that you have this one linear view, and then suddenly you get the next step, and then for whatever reason, you come back and look at that step again, it's a little bit stranger that way. It makes you have to give a reason for it. However, I'm going to give an answer that justifies it in both views. So even if you disagree with me on the seven seals and what time period they cover, the stuff I'm going to go over with the trumpet and the vials tonight, you'll be fine. You'll agree with that. And I think you'll even walk away with a better appreciation of those judgments and what they're really about. I do think maybe it'll help you to reconsider, because I will get into the seals just a little bit, not much. You got a couple verses about the seals, one passage from Matthew 24. Most of it's going to be bouncing back and forth comparing these two things. So as always, we have our question. What's the difference between the trumpets and the vials in the book of Revelation? So that's our question. With that, I always give my hypothesis. So I also explain why we ask the question usually. But my hypothesis, the thing I'm going to be trying to present to you today, is that one is a distant view of the dissolving of the earth that spoke about, for example, in 2 Peter, when he says the elements will be melted away with a fervent heat. One is the distant view of the dissolving of the earth. So it's let's say, judgment of the earth. It's God's wrath being poured out on the earth. While the other is a zoomed in look at God's judgment of the Antichrist and his followers. So we're going to see this. I'm going to throw this out quickly. Most of your trumpets, the first thing you're going to notice is that they are very distant. Like, they're not really looking so much at people, not so much at the ramifications of what happens, just like this happens and a third of this dies. Whereas the majority of your vials take specific note to the Antichrist and his kingdom. And we'll see that in the very first ones we look at. So I'm going to throw that out there to let you know what track we're on right up front. However, this is a study, so we'll go through it and look at it verse by verse. We'll compare some things. We'll bounce around a little bit across Revelation and get a better view for what these things are. And hopefully by the time we're done, you'll have a better appreciation for both of these judgments and what's going on, as well as a good grade to give for the video. You'll be convinced by what I'm trying to give you tonight. All right, so we're going to start off in Revelation chapter 8. That's what we're going to use as a text passage, although in fairness, there will be several chapters of Revelation that are equally text passages. So Revelation chapter 8, verse number 6, and we'll read down through verse 11 just to give you a little context of how the trumpets look. It says, "And the seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood. And there was cast upon the earth, and the third part of the trees was burnt up, and all the green grass was burnt up. And the second angel sounded, and it as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and a third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the third part of the fountains of the waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. So I read through that to give you, like, this is what you're seeing with the trumpets. You're seeing these huge traumatic events happening to the earth itself. And you're then seeing what part of the earth, whether it be the waters, the plants, or in one place you'll see where it's people, but you're seeing these things happening and you're seeing the consequences on what part of the earth is affected by that. So that's the main thing I want you to take note up front about the trumpets, and it'll help us as we get into this a little bit more. Now let's go read a little bit about the vials so you can see, some comparison of how they work. So Revelation 15, verse 1 through verse 4, we'll read to start with. It says, "And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, seven angels having the seven last plagues." This is the setup to the vials. We're not actually in the vials yet. And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, seven angels having seven last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God. And I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over the image, and over his mark, and over the mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having harps of God. And they sing the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Who shall fear thee, O Lord, and glorify thy name? For thou only art holy. For all nations shall come and worship before thee, for thy judgments are made manifest. So we see that this is very much about judgments, what we're about to see. In the trumpets, we're going to see an idea associated with this word dissolve. And I'll show you as we get there. But we're going to see it associated with this idea of the dissolving of the elements, of the earth being just burnt up. But here, very specifically, there's the idea of judgment and men. That the people, the nations, and the people are going to see this, and great and men everywhere are going to see what's going on, what's about to happen. And so you also notice concerning the timing of this, that you're noticing two things, hopefully, at this point: the timing and the focus. The timing being that this has to be into the last 3.5 years a little bit, because as we've said, best as I can see on everything, the Bible seems to support the idea that the persecution of the saints is primarily going to happen after that midway point, wherein the Antichrist has went into the temple, declared himself to be God, committed an abomination of desolation, and then that's when you see, even in Matthew 24, Jesus warning, and in other passages, that's when he's going to start to punish those who will not take the mark of the beast. So we're seeing that here, this has to do with that. It has to do with those people who are contending with him in that persecution. So that tells you already that this has to be in those last 3.5 years. You're setting your vials in that period. You're also setting up this idea that these vials that are about to be poured out are a lot to do with opening people's eyes to see the true God versus this false God, the Antichrist, who has set himself up on a throne, and about people coming to fear him and nations seeing him. So that's something to take in consideration about what the vials are about. Trumpets have a little less setup, so that's why I went straight to the vials, because vials actually have some really good setup right there. But let's go back actually and look at the trumpets. So we'll jump back. Like I said, a lot of jumping back and forth. We're going to go back to Revelation chapter 8, verse 4 this time, and we'll see what little setup we do get for them. It says, "And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And the seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound." And then the next thing is the trumpets being sounded. So we're seeing very much here where the focus is not so much about, hey, look at people. You're actually seems like you're looking from very far away, like you're zoomed out into space. You're looking down on these events as they're occurring to the earth. And we're seeing it from a very zoomed out view, looking at the earth itself as what's happening to the earth whereas the world system and the people are what's being dealt with when you get to the vials. So it's really like the difference between the earth and the world, where in the world, usually you should see in the Bible, it's talking about the world, like the things of the world, like the world system and the governments and the peoples and the things that the world promotes, whereas earth is looking more towards the planet itself. So you're going to see that a lot of what's going on with the trumpets has more to do with the planet and which part of the planet is being affected by that judgment, while the vials have more to do with the world system and especially the kingdom of the Antichrist. So we're even seeing that already in the setup. That's why I wanted to read those verses setting it up. Now we can go pick up our first of the vials, which you have to skip the rest of chapter 15, go to chapter 16 for that. In chapter 16 and verse number 1, uh, it says, "And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, Go your ways and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth." So the next verse is the first going out to pour the vial. I want you to notice this, that the wrath of God is what's being specifically noted here, that what's about to be poured out on the earth is God's wrath. And that term should stand out to us because it is a term associated especially with the last 3.5 years and that buildup to the day of the Lord when Christ is coming. And I'll show you even in the trumpets where that shows up. I'm sorry, in the seals where that shows up. Back in chapter 6 and verse number 17. It says, and this is, I'll read the rest of this passage later because I want to show you when it corresponds to what we're looking at. But I just want to bring this part about the wrath now. We'll come back and read the whole sixth seal in just a little while. It says, "For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" So you have the day of his wrath. In this case, all the six seals taking all these things we're going to talk about tonight. Most all of that is contained within that sixth seal. And that's why I say we do have to talk about it a little bit. But it's wrapping all that idea and saying, for the great day of his wrath has come. So in terms of setting the time period, you also see that the seals are lining up with this, that this period of his wrath being poured out would apply to that. Now, again, though, 16, we're trying to get into the first vial. Verse number 2. "And the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image. And the second angel," oh, sorry, these are shorter than what usually the trumpets each have 2 verses. So with this, you have this idea up front. We're told that when he pours out his vial of God's wrath upon these people, who is specifically is afflicted, it's those which have the mark of the beast, and upon those which worshipped his image. So in the first of those trumpets, we're seeing up front that it's about a third of plant life being destroyed. I mean, let's read that real quick again for contrast, because I've bounced around so much. I don't want you to have lost sight of what that first trumpet was. "And the first angel sounded," this is Revelation 8:7, "and the first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of the trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up." So, there's your contrast. These things start off with two that have nothing to do with each other. Now, almost all of them after this are going to correspond. They're going to be in a cause and effect type relationship where what happens in one, you see that it affects the other. So from this point on, the timeline is going to overlap. There's going to be very clearly, something connecting these things. However, that first of the trumpets has nothing to do with what we're seeing here. At least there's nothing clearly indicating that it has anything to do with it. I mean, that first trumpet says that hail and fire are going to rain down from the sky. And the truth is, you get a lot of thunderings and hails and lightning and that stuff throughout the trumpets and the vials and all of that. So you'll find where that stuff's mentioned in the vials. You'll find it in the seals maybe, but it's not something that's easy to read into. This is something that's clearly happening around the midway point, sometime around that moment when the Antichrist would be declaring himself to be God, that God is going to rain down hell and fire on the earth, and a third of plant life is going to die. It says a third of the trees and all green grass is going to be burnt up. So a third of your plant life is just going to be extinguished from this point. So you notice that's not really focused on a people group or how that's affecting people. It's the earth and what effect this is having on the earth. That straight out the gate, a third of plant life is destroyed. That's the first of these things that's going to happen as far as the punishment on the earth itself. God's dissolving of the elements. Now, then jumping back to our first of the trumpets there, our first of the vials there. There'll be a lot of me mixing up my words tonight, so just bear with me. But the first of the vials, you see, it says, "And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea." I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. "And the first angel went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image." So the first one is just, it's part of the purging of the earth. If we're going to look at this as the melting away of the elements, the burning the earth with fire, then the first one is literally a third of all plant life being burned off of the face of the earth for the trumpets. The first one for the vials, if we're looking at this, as I've said, as being a judgment of the Antichrist and his kingdom, and that's why it's more zoomed in, it's more focused, doesn't even necessarily cover the same time period. This could be starting a little bit into the 3.5 years. It doesn't have to cover the whole, like it doesn't have to begin exactly at the midway point. It can begin after, people have started to be killed and so forth. It can be a little bit into it, because you had to have given time for people to make a decision about the mark of the beast and so forth. So with this, as we're looking at it, it's very much focused not so much on the time so much as it is those people. It's not so much focused on the planet so much as it is those people. This vial gets poured out on them. It's tilted over, poured out on them, and they get sores all over them. They're sick and they're afflicted with like boils or something all over their skin. And it only happens to the people who've worshiped the Antichrist, because God is setting up for you up front. So there's no question about this. This is going to be a contrast. This one is going to be focused on the Antichrist and his kingdom. This one's going to be focused on the earth. So this is planetary judgment with the trumpets. This is the Antichrist and his kingdom judgment with the vials. That God's already showing you with the first two, and I do believe that's probably part of why there's a disconnect between the two of them. All right, and then now as we move into the next idea of this, we're going to run through all but the last ones. The second through the sixth of the trumpets and vials, you're going to notice that it's very much a cause and effect relationship. The first one set up what the focus is. The last one set up the finale of it, how these things are coming to a close. But 2 through 6 all set up the same idea, and that is that there is a cause and effect relationship going on with them. So I'll show you that by going back to chapter number 8, picking up in verse number 8 and 9. It says, "And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire, cast into the sea, was cast into the sea, and a third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed." So you have something hitting the sea, which is described as being like a great mountain burning with fire. To me, that really is like very much like we would just describe as being like a meteorite or asteroid or something of that kind of nature, where it's this massive rock burning with flame impacting the earth. So it sounds like it's huge because it's big enough that it actually manages to attack a third of the sea life. So this is oceans here. This is the word God uses to describe the oceans. So you have a third of the sea being affected by this. So this would be, let's say, I'm not going to say it's the Pacific Ocean. Don't nobody take that as like a definitive answer here, but I'm just going to use that one because that's the biggest one. So theoretically, it's going to account for close to a third of the sea. Let's say what happens in this judgment is it's essentially like God cast down a massive meteorite big enough to wipe out the Pacific Ocean, to kill everything in the Pacific Ocean, and turn the ocean into blood, destroy all the ships that are in that ocean, so that it just gets absolutely decimated in a moment. That's what the trumpet is. So you have a call. So you have something happening. It's very clear this is about the world. This is about wiping out a third of the sea life in the seas. So then you take that and understand, because this will matter when we actually get to our Bible study tomorrow on the new heaven and new earth, that he tells you there is no more sea at that point. So this is relevant to that. However, it's the vial that actually gives us a little bit more understanding as to what happens as a repercussion to all of this. So that's in chapter 16, of course, this time verse number 3. I started to read it just a minute ago. It says, "And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea." So what's the thing we know about the oceans? The oceans have like there's boundaries you can see within them. It's crazy. Sometimes you see where the waters meet and there's like changing of color. There's so much neat stuff going on in ocean currents. But the thing we also know about oceans is they're all connected. It's water. It may not be that it naturally connects so easily, but essentially what's being described to you as happening in this moment is that God cast down, I'm going to call it a meteorite for ease, for people who want to identify the trumpets and vials as things like bombs and all this kind of crazy stuff you want to come up with. God saying it's like a mountain. He doesn't say it is. He says like a mountain being cast down. That's a meteorite. If you want to try to make it something else, you're trying to go way beyond what God's describing. I'll also point out a lot of the things that people try to change in the seals, vials, and trumpets and say that it's this, or this. You have to ignore the fact that a lot of those things that God will talk about are things that already exist. Especially, I won't get into it, but some of these things you'll see they've already happened in the plagues and so forth. So that's why I say some of this you just have to realize that it is what it is. However, in this case, he describes to you essentially this idea that this decimation, killing so many things, just feels. Can you imagine a traumatic event so much to the, and again, Pacific Ocean I'm using because it's the biggest, not because that's where it's going to happen at. But just imagine if the Pacific Ocean was hit by a massive meteorite so big that that everything in that ocean died, and that ocean is just filled with blood, and all the ships that are in that ocean are destroyed. I mean, just imagine what impact that's going to have on the world. Well, the vial tells you what the impact is. Eventually, all that blood that has now filled that entire ocean starts to turn into dead men's blood. It starts to rot, because that's the difference between being blood and dead men's blood. It's now rotting blood. It's now decaying, and it's becoming, disgusting and vile. More so than what it would be not up front. And so now it's also starting to spread and poison the rest of the seas, so that all the seas are becoming like this, and all the animals in the seas are dying. So essentially, what he's telling you is in that last 3.5 years of the tribulation, one of the first things that's going to happen, first thing, if we're going by the trumpets, because that's pretty much set to cover the last 3.5 years, as far as we can tell. There's no reason to think it covers anything beyond anything before. That when you look at those trumpets and you're focusing on that last 3.5 years, the first thing is like God's going to rain down hell and destroy a third of the plants. But in reality, while immediately a third of the sea is going to be destroyed, so let's say that one ocean or something of that nature, it's going to spread. And so within a not too long amount of time, it's going to start to rot. It's going to start to decay. And all the oceans, all that salt water is going to be poisoned with the decaying corpses of dead animals across the entire world. I mean, think about the sea life that's in the ocean. If all of that was weaponized and turned into a decaying mass of poison, then all the oceans are going to become like a rotting pile. It's like dead men's blood. Now, I'm not going to say it has nothing to do with the meteorite. The meteorite itself may also bring some quality to this that makes it spread, that makes it worse. I'm not going to say that has nothing to do with it. I'm just saying that you see a cause and effect there, that what happens in that first attack, as it begins to rot and decay, it poisons the rest of the oceans, which then causes life in them to die, which causes them to rot and decay. And so you're able to do that because the amount of ocean life is so massive, and then also you devastate 1/3 of it in a moment. So then the other 2/3 are easily poisoned by that. All right, so that's what you have across the first two of each. You have the first one set up this idea that they are different because they're different in what they're looking at. The focus of them is different. The time period is mostly the same, but the focus is different. And then the second two set up this idea that it's very much going to be a cause and effect relationship. That one is looking from space at this happens. The other one is bringing your focus to the earth and seeing what effect that has on the earth, what effect that has on the people that live there, and so forth. Like I said, there's going to be a lot more focus on the kingdom of the Antichrist and the vials. I'm not going to lie and say that all of them are laser focused on them. Some of them, again, are just direct cause and effect. All right, so then looking at the third one, we'll jump back to chapter 8 again. chapter 8, verse number 10. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. And men died of the waters because they were made bitter. So we know when God says water is made bitter, it means it's poisonous. You know that because, for example, when Israel's in the wilderness and they can't drink the water because it's poisonous, God uses the word bitter. So he's telling us that there's a star falling from the heaven named Wormwood. There's going to be some stuff that connects this to the idea of an angel. Let's, for now, not get into that because it's too much if I'm going to try to get through the rest of the study tonight. So the idea of this star Wormwood, this thing falling to the earth, which you can identify it as what you want if you want to take it as meteorite or anything tonight. This star falling to the earth called Wormwood, it's going to fall into a freshwater area. So unlike the first thing that impacts the earth, which seems very clearly to be a meteorite, this next one, or an asteroid or something of that nature, this next one that now is falling to the earth, which you call it comet, you can say it's angel, you say whatever. I'm not going to argue with that tonight. This next one is called Wormwood. So we're just going to call it Wormwood to make my life easier. So Wormwood falls to the earth, and whatever it is, it poisons the fresh water supplies. It hits in such a way that a third of fresh water all becomes this. Whatever this is, it spreads throughout it and infects it. And so that a third of the water on the earth is now made poisonous. So that's what you get with the trumpet. So again, the earth is being greatly afflicted. So you've already lost, by this point, you've lost most, if not all, of your salt waters to the blood and the decay. Now your fresh water is being dried up to where men's not going to have access to that anymore either. It's becoming poisonous. So let's jump over to your vials. And in this case, we're going to be in Revelation 16 again. We're going to read verse 4 through 7, because this is where you start to get more context from these. Because this is where you'll see it's very much focused on the kingdom of the Antichrist again. So verse 4 says, And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of water, and they became blood. And I heard the angel of the water say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And I heard another voice out of the altar say, Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments. So you see, it's very much in this case focusing on this as being a consequence for the kingdom of the Antichrist and his followers because of where they have shed the blood of those who've put their faith in God. It's they've shed the bloods of the saints and of the prophets, and so it's good that they have nothing but blood to drink, because now you see that the poison that happened to a third part of fresh water is afflicting all fresh water, so that it's becoming as blood. So now, whether this is more so, let's say, an event wherein the poison causing the animals to die is causing the fresh water to fill with blood, or whether it's an event where this is still a carryover from the blood being covering the entirety of salt water, and that's now seeping into the fresh water through the underground water systems and so forth. Either way, you're getting to a place where the fresh water is being poisoned with blood. It's being filled with blood, and God is giving them blood to drink as a very poetic punishment for them because of all the blood that they've shed of the saints. So he's giving this to the world, but again, it's very much focused on the kingdom of the Antichrist and the blood that they're shedding in that moment. So you're seeing that judgment being poured out on them. So you see again, salt water's poison in one, or salt water's turned to blood in one. Next one, that blood's decaying and spreading across all salt water. A third of fresh water is poisoned. The next one, probably in my opinion, the blood of the animals that are dying, because fresh water tends to have a lot of animals living in it. That fresh water, all those people that are poisoning it, dying in it, or animals dying in it, whatever's dying in it, or maybe even the blood carrying over from the salt water has now poisoned all of the fresh water to make it where it's becoming impossible to find fresh water anymore on the earth. So you have to imagine at this point you still have time left. It's not like the end is coming in a day. So people are going to have to get really creative in that period about just surviving because the water and everything's being poisoned. And that's where I think sometimes we miss this. Sometimes we think about the kingdom of the Antichrist. We almost think about it like everything just to be normal and perfect. And we forget that the world's going to be absolutely decimated in that time period. I mean, 3 years, just barely into the last 3.5 years, just barely into that. And you've already wiped out the majority. Let's say by the halfway point, you've wiped out the majority of water on the earth. Water and plant life has been absolutely destroyed. All right. So then, with that said, we'll look at the next one, which is a very important one, and this is one we'll compare some outside of the passages that we're in. But we'll jump back, of course, to chapter number 8. As always. So we're going to look at chapter number 8, verse number 12, and verse number 13 this time. This is for the fourth one. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and a third part of the moon, and a third part of the stars. So as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpets of the three angels which are yet to sound. So there's a couple things to unpack here. One is that this is very much being presented to you as a, look, guys, this is lights out. I've always said this. When you look at it, the way that a business will cut their lights off, like the restaurants or bars are very famous for this, or grocery stores. I remember I would go to shop at the Food Line where I was from after I'd get done running the bus route on Wednesday nights at my church. And it was very common. They close at 11. Barely get in there just before then. And so I would shop as much as I could before they were going to close. And it was not uncommon at all that 10 minutes before closing time, the lights would start dimming. They would start cutting them. They couldn't cut them all the way off, but they'd cut. Actually, in all honesty, it's quite fitting. They'd cut them down about 33%. Yeah, they cut them not quite half, but almost halfway down from what they normally are. And then a lot of your coolers and stuff that had lights in them, those would cut down. And it was like a warning call. Look, we're closing soon, guys. Get your stuff and go. And God is presenting it this way. That's why he says that, look, what's about to follow are great woes. So know some really bad stuff's about to happen after this. This is your last major warning. The reason I bring that up is because you also see that Jesus presents it that way in Matthew 24, verse 32 through 35, when he gives the parable of the fig tree. And he's talking actually in that moment about the stars falling down from the sky. And he says, just like just like when a fig tree blossoms, you know that it's almost summertime because it's spring, and just before summer comes spring. So you know that when you see these things happening, and at that point again, he's talked about the Antichrist and him attacking the people who won't worship him, but he's also very much talked about the stars, and that's the thing that's most closely connected to when he says this. And I'll show you another reason I believe that that's what he's mostly speaking about in a moment, because you see that in the seals. You also see it in Old Testament prophecy. But Jesus says that that's the moment when you know that it's springtime. Summer's just around the door, just around the corner. I mean, it's just outside the door. And so summer is about to come, or in this case, what he means is that Christ is about to split the sky. The sky is about to roll back like a scroll, and all nations are going to see him. So that's what the sun, moon, and stars being darkened has that major impact. That's what the parable of the fig tree in that passage is about, as he's talking about how that when the fig tree blossoms, it's almost summertime. When the sun, moon, and stars darken, it's almost time. Christ is really at the door at that moment. Now, the thing I want to go back to, and if you want to look at those verses up I'm referring to in that parable of the fig tree, that's Matthew 24, 32 through 35. But what I want to go back to is actually here in Revelation. And that's chapter number 6, where we've already been. But I told you we'd come back and read the rest of the sixth seal. It says in verse number 12, And I beheld when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell unto the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind. So I don't think God does stuff by accident. So consider that the fig tree in this story that's casting her untimely figs is talking about the sun, moon, and stars, and the stars falling from the sky. But anyways, it says, "And heaven departed as a scroll when it is rolled together, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places," which is something we're told it happens when Christ comes back. So that's how you know that this sixth seal cannot be at the end of the midway period, because this doesn't happen until the end of the 7 years. Otherwise, everything has to happen in the first 3.5 years, because the vials and the trumpets end with similar stuff. And the description of that is given everywhere as being what happens on the day of the Lord when Christ comes back, especially getting Isaiah. All right. So, anyways, and the kings of the earth, verse 15, and the kings of the earth, and the great men, and rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains. Again, go read Isaiah 2. You'll see that's what happens the day that Christ comes back, and every eye sees him. And said to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" So we have this is summing up the last 3.5 years. Now he's taking, and here's another place where people make a mistake, because if you think that this is the midway point, which a lot of people do, then you think he's saying that the last 3.5 years is the great day of his wrath. You have a whole cult built around that these days. But what you have honestly here is he's taking the last 3.5 years and he's condensing it down. And here's why I can prove to you that it has to be that way. And I'm giving you this for a reason. The sun, moon, and stars right here you see being afflicted. He said, "I beheld when he opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood." So if the sun's already blackened like sackcloth of hair, then when you get to the trumpets, if the trumpets take place separate from the seals, then what sun is there left to darken by 33%? Because he says a third of it is darkened, and a third of the stars fall, and a third of the moon is smitten. So if that's the case, that there's no overlap between these two. Because the way this reads as the seal, this is, you could take this as the end result of this, what the sun's going to look like by the time all this is done. But if you take this as happening before the trumpets, which is what's commonly taught, then you get in trouble, because now there's no sun to be cut in a third, to be cut that one third of its light away, because there's the light from that sun. But anyways, as you have those, and then verse 13, "And the stars of heaven fell into the earth, even as a fig tree casteth her untimely figs when she is shaken of a mighty wind." So you have this thing that in Matthew 24, he only talks about that happening once. So this can't be that this happens and then it happens again in the trumpets and it happens again in the vials. It has to be that this happens one time, because Matthew 24 only has it happening once. Isaiah talks about it multiple times. It only happens once. Zephaniah, I believe, talks about it. It only happens. There's lots of Old Testament prophets talk about this, and every time it only happens one time. So it can't be that it's happening multiple times. It's not God cutting the lights off and then cutting them back on and cutting them off and cutting them back on and then cutting them off again. It's not that he has a dimmer switch and they're getting a little darker and a little darker. I mean, you could argue after that first affliction that there's some truth to that, but you can't argue that this is the first turn of the dimmer switch, because it goes straight to black here. So my point is, anybody who wants to argue with what I present about the seals taking place so that the fifth and sixth seal would have to cover the fifth and sixth seal, and of course the seventh as well, since that's the silence in heaven, would have to cover that last 3.5 years, so that you have the whole 7 years being represented across the seven seals. If you don't agree with that, you have a major problem, because otherwise you have to explain how the lights get cut back on for God to cut them off again when we get to the trumpets. So that's why I wanted to go back and pick this up in the Matthew 24 and in the seals, was to show that this is something that's covered in detail. And you'll notice some of the other stuff we're going to look at and we're going to read about, and some of the other vials and trumpets as we get there, also mentioned in what I just read to you. But I want to show that especially with the sun, moon, and stars, because God treats that as his final, like lights out moment. Like, okay, it's closing time. We're getting ready to close up shop here. But we've read it then that a third of these things happen in the trumpets. Let's go read what it looks like when you get to the vials. The vials, admittedly, actually have the least amount of overlap. It seems really you're just seeing straightforward a consequence here. And that's Revelation 16, verse 8 and verse 9. It says, "And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory." So, just so you know, the reason why I do believe this has to be overlap, one is because God doesn't mention stuff by mistake. So, the fact that the seal says that at this moment something's happening to the sun and it's dying and it's going to turn black, the fact that the vials, or I'm sorry, the trumpets tell you what happens to the sun, that a third of it just dies, like in a moment, it's just cut off. A third of the sun, the stars begin to fall from the sky, the moon begins to die. A third of all of that stuff is just afflicted in a moment by something God does to it. And then here you get this idea that something happens to the sun and it begins to shoot out a great heat, whereas many would interpret it as being something like maybe like a solar flare, wherein you just have this burst of heat lash out, like the sun's lashing out in pain as it's been afflicted, figuratively, of course. But you have this idea being presented there. Now, whether you believe it's consistent heat and people die over time, whether you believe it's immediate, that that just something happens, like the sun like just makes this transition, like something burst and then it starts to die. Whatever happens in that moment, a third of men are afflicted by this. I mean, if you think about what it says, scorch men with fire is what it tells you. And when the men are scorched, I'm sorry, not a third of men. A third of men is with the next one, or with one coming soon. But men of the earth are scorched with this fire. People begin to be hurt with this. They begin to be afflicted with it. But even though people are being hurt, like the temperature's turned up and the earth is really being melt with a fervent heat, like God talks about, uh, you notice the big thing in this passage is not so much the heat or what's happening to the sun as the response of the people. And that's where verse 9 it says, "And men were scorched with great heat and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory." So the people still, they refuse to turn. They're just stubborn. And so that's where you see this is very much people, kingdom of the Antichrist focused, that you're getting the response of the people who are being punished by God in this moment. Some of these being focused only on the kingdom of the Antichrist, some of these afflicting all the people there. So you're seeing, again, I believe, a cause and effect in that relationship. Then the next one, for the fifth one, we have to go to Revelation 9 this time because we finished chapter 8. "And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key to the bottomless pit." So in this case, you see the star is definitely an angel, and that's why I say there's an argument to be made about all of that. I just don't have time to get into it right now. "And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by the reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power as scorpions of the earth to have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither the green thing, neither any tree, but only those men that have not the seal of God in their foreheads." So in this case, it's almost the opposite of what you're seeing with some of the vials. It's not that God's going to hurt specifically those who worship the Antichrist. He's hurting anyone who hasn't got the mark of the mark of God. These aren't the people who aren't following God. And again, that's another thing where there can be some debate about how big that group is. And I don't have time to get into that tonight because the question is not about this specifically. It's about the difference between the vials and the trumpets. And we're running long and I've got to get through it. So what you have here is there's actually some really interesting stuff. I mean, for the next several verses, it actually goes all the way down to verse 12. You get the description of these locust creatures that are coming out, and they're just, going across the earth, and people are being afflicted by them, and the pain hurts men for 5 months, and it's really just like this incredible thing you're reading about. It's so bad that people want to die, but it's not killing them. It's hurting them. So you have this thing there that God tells us about. But the one I want you to focus on, because as I've said, the question is not about explaining the trumpets in great detail. It's about showing the contrast between them and the vials, is what happens when the pit opens. Because when this pit opened, it says that when it's opened, smoke begins to pour out and it begins to fill up the sky, is what we're being told. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit, in verse number 2. So let's go down to the vial then. In this case, Revelation 16, verse 10 and 11. It says, "And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain, and blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds." So what does that actually sounds like everything. And to be honest, that it sounds like it includes even the locust, everything that was in that chapter that we just looked at that actually covers, from 1 to 12, verse 1 to verse 12. So, the majority of that chapter, it seems like it's all condensed down into two ideas. And those two ideas are very much focused on how that affects the kingdom of the Antichrist. So the trumpet tells you, like, this is how the earth is affected. The smoke begins to pour out, and what little light the sun is still giving at this point starts to be, blotted out by that smoke that you can't see it anymore. It's been blocked out, I should say. And then with this, these locust creatures begin to pour out of the pit. Anybody who doesn't have the seal of God on their forehead begins to be afflicted. So it's almost opposite of what we're seeing in terms of it's not really focused on the king of the Antichrist, it's focused on the earth, and making sure we get the note that the people who are not the king of the Antichrist, the people who are following God, are the ones who are spared from some of this pain. Whereas when you get to the vial, it very much says, oh, no, this is the king of the Antichrist, and what's happening to them is that the sun is just, it's darkness. It's full of darkness. You can't see the sun anymore. Just the sky's black now because of all this smoke. And then not only is the sky blackened because of all the smoke, so his kingdom is, in darkness now, but also the people in his kingdom are suffering because they're being afflicted by these scorpions. That it says the pain is so great that they'll wish to die, and for 5 months, they're going to be afflicted by this. So for 5 months, these creatures are afflicting them. So you have this, what's been presented to you. Well, I'll read it again. And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast. So this is being poured out very specifically upon the kingdom of the Antichrist. And his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain. So wherever this pit opens, the smoke is thickest over the kingdom of the Antichrist, is what that should say to you. So if we're going by what we've presented about his kingdom, it's going to be over, an area that's encircled around with Israel, pretty close to the middle of it. That area is going to be the most dark. That's where the smoke is going to be the thickest. And so his kingdom is going to be full of darkness. And we talk about the poetry of him making them drink blood. Think about the poetry of taking the devil's kingdom and making it a kingdom of darkness and filling it with demonic like creatures that are going around afflicting people. It's really makes a lot of sense when you start saying it like that. All right. So at this point, we are getting close to the last ones. We got two more of each. So let's go and get the sixth trumpet and the sixth vial, and you'll see there's some connection in this as well, although it's smaller. Revelation 9 verse 13. Revelation 9 and verse 13 says, and a sixth angel sounded, and the sixth angel sounded, and heard a voice from the four horns of the golden altar, which is before God, saying to the sixth angel, which had the trumpet, loose the four angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And four angels were loosed, which were prepared for an hour and a day and a month and a year, for to slay the third part of men. And the number of the army of the horsemen were 200,000, 200 million. And I heard the number of them. And thus I saw the horses in the vision, and them that sat on them, having breastplates of fire and of jacinth and brimstone. And the heads of the horses were as heads of lions, and the mouth issued fire and smoke and brimstone. By these three was the third part of men killed by the fire and by the smoke and by the brimstone which issued out of their mouth. For their power is in their mouth, and in their tails, for their tails were like unto serpents, and had heads, and with them they do hurt. And the rest of the men which were not killed by these plagues yet repented not of the works of their hands, that they should not worship devils and idols of gold and silver and brass and stone and of wood, neither can see nor hear nor walk. Neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornications, nor of their thefts. And I want to show you a couple things that are interesting in this. I'll go and tell you up front that the next vial that we're going to compare to this tells you that the river Euphrates dries up. So there's some angels bound on the river Euphrates that their goal is to go out with these beasts, it would seem, these 200 million demonic horsemen or whatever they are, and go and destroy a third of the people on the earth. Like it's time to start culling out people now. We've dealt with the plant life, the waters, and so forth. The sun, moon, and the stars. Now it's time to deal with people, and a third of the people on the earth are going to be killed. Now, Understanding that, what I want you to realize is that the cause and effect is very clear, that when these angels are being unleashed, that river Euphrates is going to be dried up as part of this. And then these armies are going to go out and they're going to start killing. But what I want you to notice is in the vials, when we focus on people, a lot of times we're looking very specifically at the kingdom of the Antichrist. Sometimes it doesn't explicitly say that, but it still seems to be that that's the intention. Here we turn our focus to people because that's who's being afflicted during this judgment. But you'll notice something. It doesn't put the attention on the kingdom of the Antichrist. It doesn't say that they'll learn not to worship the Antichrist. It says that they will not worship devils and idols of gold, silver, and brass, and stone, and of wood. Neither can see, nor hear, nor walk. Neither repented they, and this is sins, neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. So it's not so much that they didn't turn from their worship of the Antichrist, which is what you're seeing in the vials. In this case, that they're not turning from their false religions, period, because there'll be people who still seem to have other religions. There's a primary world religion, but it would seem that there's still people with idols and stuff that they're worshiping, because we know when Christ comes back, it says that men will hide their idols, that they'll bury them in caves and bury them in the ground, and they'll refuse to give those up. So anyways, you see that there's still people who aren't necessarily part of the kingdom of Antichrist, but still refuse to turn to God after everything they've seen. And that's what this judgment is dealing with. And so reality, I'm going to assume that most of the people who are being killed in this time period are probably people who are not directly going to be involved with the Battle of Armageddon as much. I mean, obviously not everybody that's represented in what I just said is going to die in that period. I'm just assuming that the majority of people who are going to be afflicted in that time period are going to be those people. So if you don't live around the area around Israel and you want to know where your country's at in Bible prophecy, I got bad news for you, because that's probably the part of the story that's going to pertain most to people like Americans and stuff like myself. So anyways, saying that, let's go look at the vial and how that compares. Verse 16, chapter 16, verse 12 of Revelation. It says, "And the sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, and that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared. And I saw three unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. For they are the spirits of devils working miracles, which go forth unto the kingdom of the earth and of the whole world, to gather them to the battle of that great day of the God Almighty. Behold, I come as a thief. Blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And they gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon." So they're being gathered to the valley of Megiddo, is what he's saying. He's saying that while the river dried, as these angels are being unleashed from it, is what it seems to be saying. If you compare the two, it's also being dried for a very express purpose, and that's to go ahead and gather the kingdom of the Antichrist and those who are going to be battling in the battle of Armageddon. Anyone who's supposed to be involved with that the Antichrist is going to go ahead and begin his call. He's going to send out these unclean spirits to start calling people to this battle, and this is where people really start to arm up and get ready to go attack Israel in the battle of Armageddon, which we know Christ is going to come back and stop that. So you have to be really at the last of the last days right now, because Christ is getting ready to come back and stop this battle that is getting ready to happen. But God says he makes way for them to get there by drying up the river. That's his part in this. But the part about actually gathering for the battle is done by the Antichrist and by the devil and by the false prophet. So they're the ones who are actually gathering the people. Now, God does talk about putting a hook in the jaw and drawing people to battle. So it's not like he doesn't have a part in it. But the devil are the voices who are actively going out and calling people into the battle. So anyways, there's where we're at as we're seeing the cause effect. You notice from 2 to 6, there's always what seems to be a cause and effect. A big traumatic event and then a logical effect from that. Now, in this case, you can almost look at it as the opposite, that you have the big event being the drying of the rivers, but the reason is then explained in the trumpets, is to let out those angels, and then also as the river Euphrates is dried, it makes a path for the people to come in and gather to attack Israel. there in the Valley of Megiddo. So now, as we come to the end of all of this, we're getting just one last point I got to bring out, and that's the last of each of these, the last vial, the last trumpet. So hopefully everybody's been able to stay with me through all of this and follow what I'm giving you, because I'm trying to rush through major earth-shattering events in a moment. So we've seen the first two really teach us about their focus. The next, 2 through 6 teaches about the cause and effect. The last two teaches about their finish, about what they're doing in the finale of it all, how they finish. And so chapter 11, verse 15 is where you find the last of the, chapter 11, verse 15 is where you find the last of the trumpets. So it says, and the seventh angel sounded, and there was a great voice, and there were great voices in heaven, saying, the kingdoms of this world are become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. And for the 24 elders which sat before God on their seats fell upon their faces and worshiped God, saying, we give thanks, O Lord, O Lord God Almighty, which art and wast and art to come, because thou hast taken to thee thy great power and hast reigned. And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged. And thou shouldest give reward unto thy servant the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, small and great, and shouldest destroy them which destroy the earth. And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of the testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thundering and earthquakes and great hail. You notice a lot of that stuff is, especially that earthquake that'll shake the earth out of its place. A lot of this stuff is very much connected to what we read in the sixth seal. You notice very plainly the language here is talking about the second coming of Christ, that he's taking power over the earth, and that the nations are going to bow down to him. You also notice there's very clearly language here talking about the judgment of nations. There also seems to be language talking about the judgment of the dead. Let me read verse 18. It says, the nations were angry, and wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and thou shouldest give reward unto the servant. So there's multiple judgments seems to be being mentioned within that passage, because you have the judgment of nations coming at the setup of his kingdom, and of course the judgment of the dead, small and great, coming at the end of his kingdom. So it's very much what you're seeing with the seventh trumpet, is that it's extending beyond. It's very much a huge scope what it seems to be presenting to you, but it's very much setting up the Christ coming back and setting up his kingdom. It doesn't necessarily go into his kingdom, but it's looking at least a little bit beyond the 7 years of tribulation, beyond the last 3.5 years specifically, to look into the kingdom of Christ a little bit, as you're getting some stuff about the judgment of nations, Christ setting up his throne here on the earth, and then the mention of and the time of the dead, that they should be judged. That really seems to point to something that happens at the end of the kingdom of Christ. You see that very plainly presented later in Revelation. So what we're seeing is, especially talking about the temple of God being open in heaven and so forth, things coming down to earth and such, you're very much seeing the kingdom of Christ being the early stages, at least, but I see it as maybe even like a condensed view of the kingdom of Christ being set up here on the earth. So what you have there is that you're being showed that the judgment's taking place in the trumpets extend beyond just the last 3.5 years to look at the kingdom of Christ, because actually the kingdom of Christ is where all that's going to be repaired. It's in his kingdom that he'll make the new heaven and new earth, that he repairs the damage that was done, which again, we'll look at in our study tomorrow in our church service as we look at the new heaven and new earth. But you're seeing, because it was always about the earth, that it actually extends beyond the kingdom of the Antichrist in those last 3.5 years of tribulation into some of what God's doing to repair the earth and judge the nations and so forth that take place after the last 3.5 years a little bit. So I'm not saying it goes full blown into that. I'm just saying it does seem to extend beyond that some. All right. And then the last of your vials, Revelation 16, verse 17 through 21. It says, and the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there came a great voice out of the temple of heaven from the throne saying, it is done. And there were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great. And the great city was divided into three parts, and the cities of nations fell. And Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath. And every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Think about that sixth seal, because you see that in the sixth seal. And there fell upon men great hail out of heaven, every stone about the weight of a talent, and men blasphemed God because of the plague of the hail, for the plague thereof was exceeding great. So this seventh vial is the falling of Babylon. Babylon's being destroyed, and Christ is about to come back. This is the moment as he's getting ready to come back and put an end to the battle of Armageddon. You see that as you read the Revelation, I guess 18, 19, that area, as Babylon starts to fall, and you have Christ coming back and smiting the Antichrist and putting the final end as he takes him and throws him alive into the lake of fire. And he takes those that are there with him at the Armageddon and throws them into the lake of fire. And they don't even go before the judgment; they just go straight into the lake of fire. You have that happening there. Is pretty much what's being described here. This is not necessarily going, it's covering some of that because the islands and the mountains happen when Christ appears. So some of this has to be covering beyond the people being thrown in, but also some of this covers the build up to that as Babylon's being destroyed. But you notice that his kingdom, Babylon the Great, Mystery Babylon, is what's being focused on in this moment. That is the destruction of Babylon, that this is it. The kingdom of the Antichrist is falling down. Whereas with the last of the trumpets, it went beyond that. It was looking at the nations and how the nations were going to have to bow down to Christ at the judgment of the nations, the sheep and goat judgment, and then how people were going to have to submit to him in his kingdom, and that the earth was going to be repaired. This is the kind of stuff that shows you that those trumpets were focused more on the earth, while the vials were focused more on the kingdom of the Antichrist. So saying all of that, let's look at our evidences again as we try to present this idea that the difference between the two is one is a distant view of the dissolving of the earth, while the other is a zoomed in look at God's judgment on the Antichrist and his followers.
Evidences. 1. The trumpets seem to begin with the start of the Great Tribulation, while the vials begin after the mark of the beast has been implemented. 2. The trumpets are all focused on the earth and God dissolving it, usually looking at which part of the earth is being destroyed. 3. The vials often show the effects of the trumpets on people, specifically in regards to the kingdom of the Antichrist. 4. While the vials end with the destruction of the kingdom of the Antichrist, the trumpets extend beyond to show how the rest of the earth is dealt with.
So now, saying all of that, there's my answer. The grading system, as always, falls like this. If you were convinced, like if you walk away from this, you're like, okay, that makes perfect sense. That answered my questions. Then I'm going to ask you to grade this video. Put it in the comments. Let us know that your grade for this is the sound doctrine. Go ahead and leave us that comment. This is sound doctrine. If you see it, like it makes some sense to you, but you're not really sure you're convinced about it yet, then say almost persuaded in the comments. If you are on the fence, like you don't really lean one way or the other, you weren't really convinced, but you're not really against it, then you can put unsure. If you are against it, I didn't convince you, but you don't want to be rude and tell me I'm a heretic or something, then put unconvinced. That's the answer if you disagree, is unconvinced. If you are on the fence, it's unsure. If you get it, but you're not all the way there, it's almost persuaded. If you're fully on board, it's sound doctrine. That's our grading system for these videos. Now, what I'm going to ask is two things. One is leave us also a comment letting us know what questions you have about prophecy. Maybe there's something that you would like me to answer. So ask your questions about prophecy, and I'll be sure to try to work those into future studies. The other question I'm going to ask is that if you're not subscribed to our channel, like, share, subscribe. We're about to hit 4,000. In fact, by the time this comes out, we'll pass 4,000 subscribers. So make sure you're one of those. Be sure you're commenting, liking the videos, getting involved. And of course, that 4,000 is on YouTube, I should say, because Facebook has its own number. Anyways, we're on a lot of different formats, a lot of subscribers on each of them. I think it's 1,000 on Twitch already, but go ahead and get involved and be a part of that community, if you will. So share the videos, whatever you can do to get the stuff out there to other people. We put a lot of work into this. I think we have some of the best content ideas. You may not have the best content because of my involvement, but the ideas, I think, and the formats are some of the best I know out there. And so I'd encourage you to make sure you're sharing it with people. I know I'm the weakest link. There's not much I can do about that. So if you'll share it with people, that would be a great help. Anyways, we appreciate you being a part of this. Be sure to leave your grade down there in the comments and any questions you would like to see us tackle in future episodes of this. And be sure to like, share, subscribe, whatever you can do to help promote the ministry that we're doing here to reach people. We really appreciate that. All right. Thank you for your time and hope you have a good evening. We look forward to seeing our people of God's house tomorrow. And of course, if you like this video, there is a follow-up tomorrow as we talk about the new heaven and new earth. Make sure you check that out as well.